This is a recording of the stories we tell ourselves, narrative repentance, and true stories of God, self, church, and creation. A doctoral thesis by Reverend Dr. Robert Stephen Lawrence, read by Jennifer Dow. Father Robert is the parish priest for St. Luke's Greek Orthodox Church in Mooresville, North Carolina. To learn more about Father Robert and St. Luke's, visit www.stlukegoc.org. Chapter 2: Repentance and the Healing of the Soul. Another age-worn tale tells of two monks traveling back to their monastery after an errand to the city. Traversing the countryside, they come to a small river with a challenging crossing. A woman stands uncertain by the side of the river, wondering how she will cross. Sensing her distress, the old monk asks if she would like help crossing the river. She gratefully accepts his assistance, and the monk carries her across the river, gently placing her on the far shore. The two monks continue their journey toward the monastery in silence. After 2 hours, the older monk speaks quietly to the other. "You seem agitated. What is it that is distressing you?" "Forgive me, Father," the young monk replies. "I was taught that it is not permitted for a monk to touch a woman." The older monk smiles patiently. "Ah, the river crossing. But my dear father, I put the woman down 2 hours ago, and you still carry her." It is, again, a story charming in its simplicity but profound in its meaning. It is also notably a story that hardly seems to be about repentance, at least as repentance is understood in the proper imagination. If anything, it seems to be about failed repentance. The older monk, having broken a moral rule, do not touch a woman, shows no remorse or any intention to try harder next time. In fact, the intent of the story seems to be that the older monk is the bearer of wisdom, and the younger monk is somehow at fault for his moral qualms. The story, however, actually profoundly illustrates repentance, at least repentance rightly understood. Further, the story illustrates a number of critical aspects of repentance we briefly encounter in the first chapter. 1. Repentance is not primarily about our external moral actions, but rather is primarily about our internal disposition and how we imagine the world, our social imaginary. 2. Repentance is a continual spiritual effort that most often occurs before a moral choice is made, rather than as a response to an immoral action, formation of desire. 3. Repentance is the story of how we encounter the world, rather than a means to judge the morality of our lives, our augmented narrative. And 4. The primary arena of repentance is within our hearts and our thoughts rather than our actions. Lurking behind these ideas, though, is a fundamental question which is not obvious yet at the same time foundational to a proper understanding of repentance. Why is repentance even necessary? Under the contemporary popular account of repentance, the need is obvious. If you break a rule and do something morally wrong, you should feel remorse and endeavor to correct your behavior going forward. But what about the biblical account of repentance we briefly explored in the first chapter? Changing our way of being in the world. Why do we have to change our way of being in the world? What is so wrong with our current way of being in the world? Shouldn't we be allowed to live our lives and follow our conscience without interference? Who is to say what is the right way to be in the world? To a modern mind, these questions are urgent and challenging, but for early church writers, these questions would seem odd, even nonsensical, because these writers' social imaginary was quite distinct from our contemporary American social imaginary. To understand this fully, the last step in changing our distorted contemporary understanding of repentance is to allow one final image to revise our augmented narrative of repentance, the healing of the soul. Thus far, we have used two primary images to explore the notion of narrative repentance. We began with the notion of the priest inviting the faithful to adopt a new way of being in the world, as illustrated by the story of the monk and his visitor. Then, using the language of narrative, we expanded that notion and centered on the priest's need to guide the faithful in learning to tell true stories of ourself, God, church, and creation. A critical reader, however, would rightly observe that, other than the mention of God and church, there is nothing intrinsically Christian in these images. Indeed, popular motivational literature is filled with admonitions to change our perspective and adopt a new attitude in life. What makes narrative repentance a decidedly Christian activity, dependent on the Holy Trinity, will become apparent as we explore this final image of repentance as the healing of the soul.